Hello, and I'm here with Digby Martin Fletcher. And Digby, I'd like to know a little bit about South Africa and how you came to set your novels there.
Well, I was born there, and perhaps I could tell you a bit about how my parents came to be there. My father was born in Sutton-in-Ashfield, which is in Nottinghamshire, and brought up in Derby. His name was Eric, and I've always been fascinated by the fact that that's a Viking name, and BY is a Danish ending, and it was part of the Danelaw, and he had red hair when he had any, because he lost it pretty soon. And he went out there in 1928, joined for the bank, I think, and then he went to Shell Company, and then he met my mother, who was at the time married to a man who was I don't know what rank he was, but he ended up as a colonel in the colonial police. And I think there was a bit of a fuss about the fact that they were working at Shell and had a relationship, but anyway, the result was they got married, had my brother Simon and me, so I grew up in Cape Town, and developed an interest in the history of the place. I mean, it was a very odd place because you had apartheid, so you had this artificial world of white people behaving as if they were the only people, and then you had the unfortunate people who weren't white, which was the Khoi, known as the Cape Coloured at the time, and then we had a lot of Xhosa people from the Eastern Cape who came over to the Western Cape because there were jobs there. Obviously at school we had to study South African history, but as history always is, that was biased really in favour of the people in power.
Of course, yes.
Although in English-speaking school, they weren't that in favour of the government, and they did try to give us an objective view. And I think most people that I knew that we were living under an unjust system, and that they were hoping to see it disappear. I mean, for example, one of my father, who he wrote English textbooks, one of his publishing people was a man called Randolph Vine, who he had a lot to do with the anti-apartheid movement. And my father told me he had to flee the country and ended up fleeing on a ship in the harbour.
Where did he go to?
Well, like all people went to England those days. And so I became familiar with attitudes, and to some extent in Best Eaten Cold I have, although it's not a political book and it's not a lecture, I do reflect some of the current attitudes of the time, which were racist really, and the whole place was, what do they call it, a tinderbox. I mean, we had 1966, the Prime Minister got stabbed in Parliament. We had riots in places like Lunga. When I was at school, the armoury was closed down in case anybody got hold of their old rifles, which shot one shot at a time, but anyway. So my parents were always saying, oh, there's going to be a bloodbath. There's going to be a bloodbath. And in fact, I suppose there has been a bit, but on the whole, things have turned out as well as can be expected with Nelson Mandela and people like that. And I've become interested in the history of the place before I was born, which would be the Second World War. And Best Eaten Cold deals with a woman from England who was an agent, and I found out a lot about the fact there were submarines off the coast, and Nazis all over the place, and it's been very interesting.
Did you find it surprising to learn all that because you weren't aware of it?
Well, the cartoons in the local papers always used to represent Mr. Forster, who was, I suppose he was the Prime Minister, as a Nazi in jackboots with the swastika on him. So I think that was a little bit of a hint that
Yeah.
maybe he was a fellow traveller. And in fact, I've read a biography of his where it's mentioned that he was in a place called Coffee Fontaine, which was an internment camp.
Mm-hmm.
But you do need to remember that the Afrikaners weren't just Dutch descent, they were also German descent. And as far as they're concerned, or they were concerned, the British were their oppressors, and the Boer War was a colonial enterprise designed to stamp out their freedoms. But it was, they were right in that way, but of course they didn't really care about the indigenous population's freedom, so it was pretty hypocritical. But there definitely was a lot of ill feeling towards English-speaking people.
Did you notice any of that when you were there?
Well, you noticed it in the newspapers and on the radio, which was just one long propaganda fest, really. And at university we used to go on marches, and our leaders used to get banned, and it was interesting to see what happens to people. I mean, one chap I knew was a boy, when I went to stay with his family, and I recall him throwing golf balls at me because he was too young to play and he was a bit fed up with it. And he became Nelson Mandela's attorney later on. So it was a small place in that way because everybody you knew had something to do with power. I mean, in my boarding house, in my school, we had the leader of the opposition's son, former Governor General's grandsons, General Smuts's grandson, all there at the same time. And you just become aware, with apologies to them, of how ordinary they all are.
Yeah.
And so you get a feeling for it, and there was a lot of gerrymandering going on, and because the constitution of South Africa had actually been set up to protect the rights of some of the indigenous population, the ones in the Cape anyway, and the government from 1948 onwards was busy trying to take away those rights. I don't think quite from racial motives, but more because the mixed race people weren't voting for them. But they had to have a 2/3 majority in the parliament, and so the only way to do that was appoint more and more senators, which is like the British House of Lords. And I recall going into the parliament to look round with a whole lot of other schoolboys. And I remember the MP for Constantia, whose name was Sidney Waterman, showing us all these extra seats that had been put into this upper house, and there were masses of them. And it was just a cynical ploy, but you know, that kind of stuff goes on throughout the world. And at that time we thought there might be a nice peaceful world with everybody getting on, but unfortunately don't think that's happened really, has it?
No, hasn't. When we read about boarding schools in novels, they always sound like quite fun places to have gone to. Was it like that? Was that your experience of boarding school? Were there any, did you play any
not really
on?
mine. I mean, I've come across people. I had a client who went to a nun's place in Sevenoaks in Kent, and she thought it was great fun. But I can't say fun was what you'd call it, because the whole place was very militaristic and hierarchical, and they used to have things called prefects meetings where people just got shouted at and all that sort of thing. And there was a lot of beating going on and standing to attention and short haircuts and so on. People make do in those circumstances. The way you strike back is you have nicknames for all the teachers, you have nicknames for the senior boys, you say scurrilous things about them, you find ways of getting out of things. It's just like prisoner of war camps. And you could get out of the boarding house when you were older because there was nobody supervising you. But it's, well, in those days they thought it was a good idea, but I'd rather have not gone, to be honest. But it wasn't all bad. You had some extremely good teachers, and you learnt that you had to behave, and
or else. Yeah.
Well, exactly. And there was a lot of sport going on, and I'm sure that was very healthy, and you met some very intelligent people. And
are you in contact with any of the people that you knew then?
Yes, a few. There's a ex-barrister who came to work for my firm who was there at the time, and I go to a few of the old boys meetings in London where people turn up, and I went to a reunion a few years ago, and some people look exactly the same and other people you can't recognise. And it's wonderful to hear all the South African accents, and one of them runs a factory that makes crisps and things, and he kept on talking about snicks. We're going to have snicks. And another one has a winery, and
wow.
He's supplied all this wine.
Wow.
And it's interesting to see what happens to people. Unfortunately, quite a few keel over and die, and so the number of them that are still alive is diminishing all the time.
Of course.
And often people, when they leave school, they either do much better than you think they're going to do, or they do something different and they surprise you. So, I mean, I'm sure that happens to everybody. But it's unusual school in the sense that their old boys union is so strong. And the chap who runs it in England is extremely enterprising and friendly. And, good luck to him. He's done wonders, and he's always having little functions and interviews and that kind of thing. And, their old boys' dinner in London for a South African school gets 100 people, which is remarkable, really. I mean, most of the English people I know couldn't care less about their schools, or nothing's happening with them. So
you should send them all a copy of your book.
Well, I'm working on it, aren't I? And so I'm sure some of them have written books, but I don't think that many. Not in my year, anyway. So it's the press release for my book next week, and I'm looking forward to that, and I'm hoping something comes out of it. I feel it's a worthwhile book. I feel it'll be entertaining for people. It's quite funny in parts, although that's not the point I've pushed. And
I can agree with that because I've read it.
oh, well done to you see. And you've only been there probably once or twice, haven't you? So,
about 3 times, I think, in total.
Yes, but I think it does capture something of the personality of the place.
It does.
And I think as you get older, these things stay in your mind. And so let's see what happens, and in the next interview I'll tell you a bit more about my previous book and my next one.
Good.
And thank you very much for coming to interview me.
Yes, and stay tuned for that, folks, and we will see you again in the next video. Thank you ever so much.
Yes, I'll just show you again. This is the book.
Oh, it's got such an eye-catching cover.
Yes, we've got the swastika there, but I'm not pro-Nazi, it's just they're the baddies. There we are. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Digby. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye-bye.